All right, everyone, continuing on with the notes for Chapter 9, kicking off with Section 2 of your notes this time around and looking at TV news economics of today. The old model of journalism involved taking revenue from advertising and using it to cover local civic news. News editors aggregated news into sections of a newspaper or segments on a local newscast. And that's still pretty much how things work today. However, the internet is changing the game significantly. Internet users often hunt for news by topic and often graze among a number of news sites. And this new behavior pattern changes the traditional revenue mechanism supporting news. If you have people that are looking at multiple sources and using various ways to gather their news, whether it's a social media feed or it's a website like the Drudge Report that has links to several articles from several sources, or if you're just using a search engine to look for particular stories. All those things are going to factor into what stories you read from what sources, and therefore what sorts of advertising you're being exposed to. In 2010, more than 2/3 of the top internet news sites are largely tied to TV and newspaper financed operations, whose resources are shrinking. That means cutbacks in traditional media may significantly affect online content in the future. So you have a couple issues here. You have that people are looking for content online, sometimes that content very much provided by the very folks that are hoping that you will catch their broadcasts so that you will pay attention to the advertising on the broadcasts. But if you're getting your news from online sources, the revenue from the advertising may not be as strong, so stations might have to cut back or reformat, and each aspect of the news, each format in presenting the news, whether it's television, whether it's online, is going to affect each other. So one of the ways that many stations are trying to combat this issue is through a process called co-venturing. One important trend has been the development of cooperative ventures by television news outlets with other stations in their markets, with cable systems, and with local newspapers. So as the costs of gathering TV news mount and as new means of delivering information become increasingly available to consumers, news managers have recognized that co-venturing makes good business sense. Here's a couple examples of what co-venturing looks like. You have an example where if a television station owns another station in the market, then they may share resources and have newscasts on both stations, like the case with Channel 5 and Channel 50 in Raleigh, both of which are owned by Capital Broadcasting. You also have the case where you may have a television company taking on the resources of a competing television station in the market to provide news coverage, such as the case with Channel 22 in Raleigh, which airs a newscast produced by Channel 11. You also have this happening on the national level, where CNN and CBS have done some cooperative stuff, where you see CNN's Anderson Cooper as a regular on CBS's 60 Minutes program. And as we mentioned, it also works with different sources of news outside of television, where you may have a television station that partners up with one of the local news radio stations or with one of the local newspapers that serves the area. As far as regional and local cable news goes, regional cable news services are 24-hour localized versions of CNN, basically providing news and sometimes talk shows that are going to focus on a local or regional area. A local example of this would be Spectrum News 1, that provides ongoing news programming with customized formats. They actually service multiple markets. Here in North Carolina, they serve 4. Central North Carolina, which would be the Raleigh-Durham area. Also the Triad, the Charlotte area, and the Wilmington area, which they call their coastal region. Other local news networks provided by cable systems throughout the country will range in scope from being hyper-local. For example, there is a cable news channel that specifically serves the Bronx. And you can have stations that cover all of a market area. This happens in places like Pittsburgh. You can also have more regional types of news stations. Like in New England, they have New England Cable News, which covers stories from all 6 New England states. Global news. BBC World competes worldwide with CNN and broadcasts to more than 200 countries and territories around the world. Other international sources are abounding, which provide news in various different languages, and sometimes they'll offer versions in different languages. There's a network called France 24, which has newscasts in both French and English. News continues to be important locally and globally, not just for profitability, but also for credibility, especially for broadcast networks. Even though not many people are watching the network news as much as they used to in years past, there's still sort of a reputation that comes along with your network in light of the way that you present news coverage. This is also true of the cable news networks. They have reputations that precede them, generally in terms of where people feel that the political bias is coming from in the way that they present the news. So the way that you brand your content, the way that you present your content is going to leave a lasting impression with audiences and create a reputation not just for your news product, but for your station or for your network as a whole. All right, moving on now, let's talk about how the work structure is divided up on the TV news team. If you like graphics, there's a flow chart in your textbook that shows the breakdown and the hierarchy of these different groups. First off is the news director. This person hires news personnel, establishes news and editorial policy, and evaluates the newscast in post-mortem screenings with the staff of the news department, basically meaning they sit down and watch the newscast and they give critiques on how they did things, what went well, what didn't go well. Underneath the news director is everybody else, but the next in line is the executive producer. This person is in charge of planning and coordinating the activities of on-air and production staff and other team members for various programs. Also, this person maintains editorial control, basically deciding which stories will make it onto the air and which ones will not, and if there's any ways that a certain story is going to be written or delivered, the tone at which that story is going to be told. Ultimately, that is the role of the executive producer to determine those things. Line producers prepare the story lineup. They determine the story's lengths and decide how the stories will be handled. The producer of each newscast will proofread all copy, select graphics, and be present in the control room to make last-minute changes during the newscast. So there is a producer for each newscast that happens or each part of the news day. So you'll have a morning producer, a noon producer, a 6 p.m. producer, an 11 p.m. producer. Field producers travel with the reporters and crew and take charge of covering all aspects of covering the story on location. This tends to happen with larger news outlets, the national folks, and those in the largest of the television markets. Special segments or beats may be headed up by unit producers who assume overall responsibilities for these segments. These would be things such as the sports, as weather, as consumer reports, political reports, those sorts of things. Any of those that have special focused reporters for those things will usually have a unit producer. The main job of the assignment editor is to dispatch reporters and photographers to cover news stories. This job requires great organizational skills. So it's basically knowing where everybody is and what everybody is doing and making sure that the important news that needs to get on the air is being touched on in one way or another. One way that assignment editors try to keep themselves organized is to maintain what's called a future file. This is an annotated listing of upcoming news stories scheduled in advance. This would especially be things like if there's a grand opening of something in a local area, or if they know that there's going to be a special gathering of people, say like a charitable walk or fundraiser, or a political event that's going to be happening. They will keep a calendar of those things, and they call it a future file that they can refer to make sure that upcoming newscasts in future days are going to have those things on the docket and make sure those things get covered. Reporters receive their orders from the assignment desk. They head out and actually cover the stories. Typically, the reporter is teamed up with a photographer. However, in days of budget cuts and in smaller news operations, a lot of reporters do everything themselves. They're called one-man bands. They're responsible for shooting their own stories, for being on camera, sometimes even tasked with editing their own stories. They do it all. Correspondents are reporters who are working for larger news entities, and they will generally cover a particular beat. So you may have for example, a chief White House correspondent, or a correspondent that covers finances, or a correspondent that covers a certain part of the world. Those folks are called correspondents because those are strictly the stories that they work on. That's kind of their specialty. Another type of special reporter is called an analyst. They have a specialized knowledge about a particular field. Many times they will offer insight into certain stories going beyond what is just being reported. Sometimes this also crosses over into more speculation or opinion, as much as it does relaying facts and logistics of certain aspects of industry or certain aspects of life. Writers may prepare some material for reporters and anchors, although a lot of anchors do like to write their own material, but writers are available to actually put words to the stories, and they will often do research with reporters in developing more complex stories. And then you have the photographers and the editors. The photographers, naturally, they shoot the material, and the editor puts the packages together once everything is shot. Package, by the way, being the term for a story that is edited together. So let's talk now about the fate of broadcast journalism. Some industry estimates suggest that declining revenues for radio and TV will continue into the future, although cable networks seem to be holding steady. For local TV, audiences continue to fall across all time slots. Social media sites have emerged as powerful tools for disseminating information quickly, but it's not all roses and flowers as you go through social media. Some experts worry that efficiency of reporting, because social media can get news out very quickly, it's replacing the traditional skeptical fact-checking that provides broadcast news organizations with high credibility that it enjoyed in the past. However, there's also been the trend that news outlets have been, even before the prominence of social media, been trying to get the news out as quickly as they possibly can so that they can say that they brought you the news first. The problem is when you're too concentrated on getting the news out first, you sometimes don't get the news right. And we've seen all sorts of different networks fall prey to the idea of putting out erroneous information in the quest to be first with the information. Now, technology is shifting our focus, allowing broadcasters to cover more breaking news. This, in turn, gives stations more opportunity to influence public perceptions about the story. So, in addition to not having the gatekeepers to monitor whether news is accurate, you're also losing gatekeepers in terms of making sure that the news is being reported objectively. Bias is very much becoming more and more of a part of news programming and news reporting. The majority of Americans still get their news from television and radio, but online sources now beat newspapers as the place people turn to for news. More people are admitting that they get their news at different times throughout the day as opposed to watching a specific television newscast. This, a lot in part, is due to the availability of news online, and that news has very much been available on demand in various forms, whether online or through various means on a cable subscription box. Even local newscasters are getting into that mode where they are providing you the ability to watch the latest newscast online whenever you want to, or to be able to view certain stories that you're interested in with just a couple clicks of your mouse or your remote. All right, let's transition now from news to TV programming in general. Entertainment does not come cheap in TV and cable. A major TV network might spend more than $25 million a week on non-news programming. And a lot of that money is spent on contracts for syndicated shows, which we'll talk a little bit more about later on. There are three basic ways in which a TV station or a cable company can acquire programs to put on the air. The first is by means of the network. Network programming is original programming funded by, produced for, and distributed by the major TV and cable networks. Now, one thing to note here is that cable works a little differently because of the fact that its programming originates via the network directly to cable franchises around the country. There's no affiliates. Clearance isn't an issue here. Whereas broadcast television networks have to deal with their affiliates, which are not always owned by the network. If they're not network O&Os, which we talked about in a previous chapter, then you're dealing with one company, the network, negotiating for another company, the affiliate, to air the network programming. Syndication refers to TV programming sold by distribution companies to local TV stations and cable services. And within syndication, you have basically two different branches. There's two different ways that shows can make themselves available in syndication. First is off-network programming. These are series that have appeared first on the broadcast networks and are now being rerun by local stations or by cable systems. And the second would be what's called first-run shows. These are shows that are expressly produced for syndication that had not aired previously. So when they show up in syndication, it is the first time that they've ever been seen on television. The third way that shows are able to be obtained by local television stations or by cable companies is by means of local origination. This means that programs are produced by local TV stations or cable companies for viewers in their own communities. Examples of this would be newscasts, various types of magazine types of shows, some of the weekend sports broadcasts that local TV stations do. Anything that's produced in-house would be part of what's called local origination. We're going to get a whole lot more into this stuff as we continue on in the chapter, but right now, we'll take a break and we'll pick things back up over in part C of chapter 9.